This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 88 of Everyday Buddhism, making every day better. In this episode, I talk with Cindy Rasicot, an award-winning author of Finding Venerable Mother, a daughter's spiritual quest to Thailand, and she is also the creator of the series Casual Buddhism, a weekly YouTube presentation that welcomes people from all walks of life to explore their spiritual practice in a casual conversation with Venerable Dhammananda Bhikkhuni. She has also written articles and essays featured in Sawadee magazine and in 2 anthologies, Wandering in Paris, Luminaries and Love in the City of Light, and A Cafe in Space. Prior to retirement, Cindy worked in nonprofit management positions, following a career and education in marriage, family, and child counseling. But the focus of today's conversation with Cindy is on Cindy's spiritual life, especially her relationship with Venerable Dhammananda, the first woman to be ordained in Thailand. And that story, as she tells it in her book, Finding Venerable Mother. In a wide-ranging conversation, we discuss how Buddhism can be caught, not taught, and be first experiential and then conceptual, which is sort of the other way around that we Westerners typically think of it. But this is Cindy's experience with Buddhism. We talk, of course, about Venerable Dhammananda and her amazing and inspirational life journey from academic to activist to spiritual leader. We talk about women in Buddhism and the importance of healing the mother-daughter relationship. And we talk about the riches of experiencing multiple spiritual traditions as is modeled by Venerable Dhammananda. This was both an easy and deep conversation with Cindy. I will definitely have her back on the podcast, which I know you'll agree, after enjoying this conversation. And it starts now. Hello, Cindy, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here.
Nobody out there knows. Well, maybe they do. They might have put 2 and 2 together since I was on your YouTube podcast with Venerable Dhammananda. But we've connected a bit, so we're not like total strangers. Most of the time when I'm interviewing somebody, they're kind of like almost total strangers, but this is very nice to be able to talk to you after we've talked a bit before, so that's great. Let's dive right into it. Although the narrative of your book weaves your personal story, I give your bio at the beginning, a little bit about you, but I'm interested about, I always love origin stories, how did you get from there to there, right? Mm-hmm. So how did you get from, who you were at the time, which was some years ago when you first met Venerable, to your connection to Venerable Dhammananda. You're writing the book. Tell us about like your origin story before you went to Thailand and meeting Venerable, and then loop it into how you ended up in Thailand and meeting Venerable. It's all in the book, but I think people would love to hear your
Okay.
story.
Yeah, I think I've always been a spiritual person. I was reading the other day about a book on the presence of silence and the way that we kind of immerse ourselves in perhaps a profound spiritual experience. That happens to many of us. I had one of those experiences when I was about 6. I was just sitting outdoors. We happened to live in South Carolina in the 50s, in the deep South. And I was looking out at a tree, and I went into this deep kind of reverie and connection where I saw, interestingly enough, concentric circles. I have no idea what that meant, but it was.
You mean you saw them out there in your vision?
In my vision.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Was it concentric circles, sort of like the rings of a tree, or
kind of, but not like hard lines, but soft in a sort of a sense of entering into that, if I can describe it that way.
Well, I hate to detour your origin story but now I'm so fascinated.
Sure.
What did you sense? Since then, what have you thought of that? What does that symbolize to you?
Well, it of course I just kind of enjoyed it. I didn't make much of it. But looking back on it, I realized that was my first kind of spiritual experience where I was totally immersed in something larger and greater than myself, an experience of oneness that was so profound that I held on to it. I remember
Right.
Because Lord knows at 72, I don't remember everything. So, I think what I'm saying in terms of the origin story is there was always a yearning for that larger spiritual connection, that sense of wholeness, that sense of interconnection with the outside world. And so maybe I describe myself as a searcher. I studied psychology. I was a marriage, family, child counselor for maybe 15 years. And then I kind of segued into a different aspect of working for nonprofit organizations. But one time, this is fun, actually. One time,
isn't it fun to talk about your origin story?
Yeah. I was meeting with a program officer of a large foundation, which shall go unnamed, in San Francisco. But he basically said, "Oh, you're the Ishmael of fundraisers." And I didn't know what that meant. So I had to go look it up. But he was kind of like a searcher, and actually right now I'm kind of forgetting what he was, but it sort of captured the moment of that search and wandering. And so I was raised Jewish, but for certain childhood experiences that I had, I kind of turned away from that experience. And but always loved the sense of being at the temple and being in the ritual, hearing the music. And that has always been with me. So when I'm kind of jumping forward here, I was married for 33 years to my former husband, who is a dear friend still. And he worked for a large oil company and was transferred to Thailand in 2005 for what's called an expat position.
Right.
And at that point, I had been working for a nonprofit as a fundraiser, but I didn't work in Thailand. They only allow one person in the family to have a work permit.
Right.
So, and probably I didn't really want to work at that point anyway. I wanted to explore. So I went to a conference, and it was put on, actually, and I'm going to forget the name. It's a women's foundation in San Francisco. And they were, for some reason, they were involved in an Association of Women in Development conference in Bangkok. And so I thought, well, maybe I can find some like-minded women, feminists. I wasn't going with any particular agenda in mind, just to meet people. And they had an afternoon workshop called Faith, Feminism, and the Power of Love. And I
Wow.
thought, that's interesting, because
Yeah,
I
that sounds
heard
great.
love combined with politics or faith. Let me put it that way. So I went, and there was 9 women from various different countries around the world. And 2 of them got into kind of a contentious argument, not an argument, but contentious debate. And it kind of ended in a moment of silence. And Venerable just stepped into that. I'd never heard her speak before, in a very quiet voice, and said, we cannot solve anything in anger. Anger doesn't lead us anywhere. It is much harder to practice loving kindness and compassion. That is the goal of Buddhism. And that's when my body went kind of electric. It just went boing, kind of went on. I had maybe a real just affinity for what she was saying. I was drawn to her. It moved me. I had struggled with anger in my life. So it was a very profound moment for me to hear that. It rang true. And afterwards, she said, anyone who's interested, please come down to my temple. And that's how I began the
The whole
relationship.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in your book, and you actually hinted at it in this part of your story about your body went electric. In your book, the way you describe your that first experience with hearing her and sensing her was almost a falling in love. And I was going to ask you to tell that story anyway, but you led right into it. And I was struck by that. A lot of people have used that description when they meet the Dalai Lama. A lot of people have used that description when they meet, like, one of my ex-teachers when I was practicing in Tibetan Buddhism, His Eminence Garchen Rinpoche. He's featured in the movie For the Benefit of All Beings. You should check it out. I always plug this. My listeners are probably sick of me telling this story. And but now when you look back at that time, which is like what, 18 years ago?
Yes, it is actually. Yes.
Yeah. How how do you put it into words for maybe the doubting Thomas who is listening to us, if you know what I mean?
I'm not sure what your
Okay, well,
means.
that falling in love business, that body electric, it's like, how can you have that feeling when there's somebody sight unseen, you don't know them from anybody,
right.
They're standing up there, they say a few words, it connects with you, but then you connect with them in that kind of way. Now, there's a whole, I'm going to go off the beaten path a little bit, but you'll know where I'm getting at, and it'll help you, I think, is in the Pure Land Sutras. I'm a Pure Land Buddhist, a Shin Buddhist. And in the 3 Pure Land Sutras, there's a story of how this practitioner who named Dharmakara, who meets the Buddha, and when he meets the Buddha, he writes in the sutra, in the larger Pure Land Sutra, in this small part called the Tambutsu Ge or Sambutsu Ge, there's this almost like this love poem that he writes because he is so struck by the radiance of the Buddha's face. And at that moment in time, he says, I have to be like you. Whatever it is, whatever you got, I gotta get that. And then he makes this vow. He makes multiple vows, but essentially it's a vow that he will establish his own Pure Land. And when he does, he'll be enlightened and he will establish his own Pure Land. And if that happens, then therefore all beings will then be enlightened. And if he doesn't get enlightened and establish Pure Land, then that would tell the story. So in the gist of it is that we're all sort of enlightened by this promise of this Dharmakara who becomes Amida Buddha. So his description really made me, your description of that electric and feeling that feeling on meeting Venerable, you didn't even really meet her at the time, and hearing her, really made me think of that Sembutsuge. So tell me, 18 years now gone from that first minute, what do you think of that?
I think you described it perfectly.
I
I
didn't
think,
want to take words out of your mouth.
yeah, no, I think to one who has doubted it, maybe it is maybe difficult to understand, but and there's a saying that when the student is ready, that the teacher will follow, something like that.
The teacher appears. Yeah.
The teacher appears, yeah. And that's the sensed, felt experience I had with Venerable, was that an inner knowing on some level, on a deep level, which was more than just a intellectual level, of this woman, she's really important to me. I need to know her. Just like you said, it was like this incredible energy, desire. I mean, definitely desire to know her and understand who she is, and how did she, that was the thing. It was like, wait a minute, I want some of that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's what happens. Some of that
compassion and kindness.
Yeah, that's what happens. There's a couple of teachers I practice with who say who've taught that Buddhism is caught, not taught. Meaning you catch it as if it's a virus, or as if it's a falling in love, or if you know what I mean. And I think that's the hidden gem of Buddhism, and it's the thing I always try to teach with my Sangha and my podcast, is that you can read like a million books about Buddhism, and if you keep it in your head and it never gets in here, where I'm pointing to my heart because nobody can see me, right. If it never gets in here, then you haven't caught it. And isn't it funny that you caught it even before you even were really exploring Buddhism?
Definitely. I have what I call an experiential understanding of Buddhism way before I had the conceptual understanding of it.
That's a cool thing. That's a very cool thing, and I can understand that. I was aware of Venerable Dhammananda, but didn't know much about her background at all until you reached out to me and asked me if I'd like to be a guest on your YouTube with her. Man, she is such an awe-inspiring woman in every sense of the word.
Yes.
And then this is just beyond that spiritual thing that we're talking about. Just her dedication and her drive, especially her dedication to women. Her mother, and you can talk more about this. I'm just going to give a brief little blurb about, because I think a lot of people don't know her unless they know a lot about Thailand and that sort of Buddhism. And Theravada Buddhism isn't really that popular in the United States. So it's not, some of this is not really as well known as like the Dalai Lama, Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, but her mother was an ordained nun in a Taiwanese lineage. And then Venerable herself, before she was ordained, studied in her mother's temple, right? Her mother.
Yes, she lived there. She grew up there.
Her mother established the temple, right?
Yes, that's right.
It's amazing to me. And then Venerable went on to receive a bachelor's degree, then a master's degree, I think in bachelor's in philosophy, master's in religious
studies.
Yeah, religious studies, and then a PhD in Buddhism. And then she taught for 27 years in a university at Bangkok. And then, I found out she was a well-known author of many contemporary books and Asian Buddhist issues and so forth. And on top of that, she was married and had 3 sons and 6 grandchildren. And in 2019, she was recognized as one of the BBC's 100 most inspiring women. So what I found most inspiring about Venerable Dhammananda is that despite her global presence, right? Because
Mhm.
she was written about quite a bit when she became the first ordained nun in Thailand. I mean,
Mhm.
I read about her a lot, even though I wasn't really following her. Um, Despite that, she's dedicated to helping people in Thailand, especially women,
Mhm.
through a very, I'd say, no nonsense, concrete way of being, and also I love her outlook on sort of reforming the Thai Sangha. Like, she didn't just go get ordained and just forget about the whole thing. She wants to reestablish, the ordination of nuns in Thailand, and at the same time speaks out, like, you, in a sort of a political way, to make sure that people see women as equal, even men, all people, not just other women. So in your book, you quoted the Venerable talking about her inspiration. And I have to read this part because I read this a few times because it kind of gave me chills. You don't mind, do you?
No,
Okay.
anxiously anticipating what.
Oh, you'll see.
Okay.
Well, it's about what inspired her, what her inspiration was.
Mhm.
You talked about how you were there. There was a chant, and it was for the about the first fully ordained nun in Buddha's time, which was the Buddha's aunt. Um,
Mahapajapati.
yeah, and stepmother, when his mother died in childbirth.
Yeah.
So she said, and this is from quoting from your book, "Why do I start with this chant?" She leaned forward earnestly. "The fact that I am standing here is because of her. She is my spiritual root. I was most impressed with the Buddha's words when he accepted women to be ordained, because he said, women can be enlightened. They can see it with their own eyes.
Mhm.
This was a golden phrase," she pointed out emphatically. "The reason he allowed hundreds of women to be ordained. I always say," she said, "that the Buddha was the first feminist. He was the first one in world religions to acknowledge that men and women are equal spiritually. No one has the right to stop what was given to us. That is my strength."
Yes.
I,
Yes. It
I,
gives
I
me
don't.
chills when you read that because she is so profound in that dedication to reestablish the female lineage of Theravada nuns throughout Asia, by the way, not just Thailand. And she's dedicated her life to that. Her studies were devoted to that because her PhD was on the Patimokkha, the religious vows of that women take when they become monastics. And she wrote Thai Women in Buddhism in 1991, which was published by Parallax Press. So she's had a long history, and it's very interesting. I hope it's okay. I diverge into this. She did not know the word feminist until she came to a conference in Harvard in 1983. She understood the idea of it, certainly, because she was raised in a very egalitarian family, but nobody ever used the word feminist per se. And it was called a turning point in her life because she basically saw and heard, it was, let's see, it must have been, 1983, the voices of women who had been imprisoned for
Mhm.
in their country, powerful poems of pain and suffering. It really moved her, and she thought, it really affected her emotionally. And she thought after that, who am I? I'm this academic sitting in an ivory tower, and what am I doing? I have all this knowledge, and I'm not doing anything with it. So that's when the seed was planted on a deeper level that she actually changed from becoming an academic to an activist after that.
That's
After,
amazing. That
yeah.
is really amazing because you wouldn't, typically in the background stories of spiritual leaders, whether they be lamas, priests, roshis, ministers, nuns, um you don't you don't see that activism. You know, we have engaged Buddhism now, but then that was not really the case. You know, I mean, like, you know, from Thich Nhat Hanh was an engaged Buddhist in the same sort of, but he was Zen, but he had that same sense to him. I feel, you know, only from a male perspective. And the nuns in his Plum Village Sangha have that same sense. They're very strong. I had Kyra Jewel Lingo on my podcast.
Yes, I had her also on Casual Buddhism.
Yeah, isn't she wonderful? She's very soft spoken, but she's a strong woman. Yeah, very, which actually intimidated me because I have such a strong voice, and here she's this sweet little soft spoken.
Yeah, Kyra Jewel is.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I get that same feeling from them, but it still is very awesome.
Yes.
There's some kind of, that dedication is kind of rare, especially that combination, that dedication of the sort of the activism, the academics, and the spirituality is.
Yes. And let me say one other thing about that. She made a conscious choice after, and I think I can say this and she would be fine with it. She didn't like the anger that was expressed at the conference. She wanted to invoke change, but not through hatred or anger. And so she said, in order to do that, and she said a lot of people who are involved in social causes burn out. It's hard work. It's a lot of suffering.
It is.
She said, in order to be anchored, in order to be able to do this kind of change, I need to return to my Buddhist roots. So therefore she will say, I am a Buddhist first and a feminist second.
I love it, because that is so true. That's the protesting and you know, social justice work. And even in the engaged Buddhism community, I've met people who are, you know, the sense you get of them is this aggressiveness, this anger, this, you know, maybe it takes a little of that to get started, but you can't keep that going in any way, and it's not helpful. So I really respect that about her.
Yeah. By the way, I don't have any judgments about the anger. I think it's valid in many cases. I'm just saying, for her personally, she didn't see it necessarily serving her in the way that she could be the most effective in the world.
Well, I agree. I don't have the judgment either, because at my core, anger is one of my. Of the three poisons, mine is anger.
Yeah, mine too. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah. So, and it's, I think it's one of the hardest to control. But in Tibetan Buddhism, I was taught that, you know, in Vajrayana Buddhism, where where you actually take empowerment so that you can have a guru, and there's a transformation that takes place. Supposedly, anger is transformed into wisdom. So each of the three poisons has some strength to it. Although I'm not going to remind my wife about that, because that's probably not. Remember, it's all about wisdom. Right. So yeah,
that's funny.
Another thing that I find extremely interesting about her background, and you did too, and you talk about it in the book, is her dedication to medicine Buddha, which is really more of a Mahayana thing. And that she even though she says she did not ask him, this is what your book says, even though she did not ask him, she considers His Holiness the Dalai Lama her guru, and that she finds Tibetan texts more meaningful than Theravadan texts. So all of that is just so amazing to me, because she did take ordination in that tradition, and she is in that culture.
Let me clarify for the listeners, it's Theravada tradition. She took ordination.
That's why I said Theravada. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. She took ordination in Theravada. So the fact that she has all these seemingly deep spiritual imprints outside of Theravada, even though she's in a Theravada culture, took ordination in a Theravada tradition. And then she has the statue for the medicine Buddha in her temple. And so can you talk more about that? And also you talk about your personal dedication to medicine Buddha, which I was interested in. So can you kind of riff off of these things?
Well, for one thing, Venerable Dhammananda is kind of unusual in the sense that she went to Canada for her master's degree, and she herself is the type of person who kind of looks beyond culture. You'll hear her talk about her love. One of a Christian minister gave her a picture of Jesus on the cross, which she proudly talks about.
Wow.
Because she identifies with, let me see if I can get the story straight, the death of, I don't want to go into it because I can't remember it exactly, but let me just say that she has a deep love and respect for other traditions. So maybe that's just partly who she is. She's open to that. And she has an intellectual curiosity that
exactly
that brings her, to that interest. The story about the medicine Buddha, maybe I go into the book, I can't remember, is that 7 years before she was ordained, she had a kind of a deep visual meditation where she imagined the medicine Buddha coming in through her knee, of all things, and traveling up her bloodstream. And I think she saw this image of the medicine Buddha, and it's the same medicine Buddha that she had crafted in the medicine Buddha Vihara at her temple. But she actually literally went around searching for similar images, and she couldn't find them. So it was partly her own, I don't want to say, I don't know if it's imagination or creation, but she had a particular image in mind that she wanted. And that is the image that sits in the Vihara. And I had maybe a personal experience with the medicine Buddha once accidentally before it was actually finished, the construction of it. The curtain was up for some reason, and I peeked behind it. And I saw the medicine Buddha, and I had another one of those kind of aha experiences where, who is this? What is this? I'm drawn to this. And at the time I was having major back problems, and she gave me the medicine Buddha prayer, which is a beautiful mantra. And I just incorporated it into my daily meditations. And I found that it was very healing for me. I call him a he, I don't know if that's correct or not. The medicine Buddha kind of became a spiritual guide for me in my healing process. And I asked Venerable about that once. I had a conversation. I said, well, basically Buddhism doesn't talk about believing in gods outside of ourselves or false, I don't know, maybe I'm getting Judaism mixed up, but false idols.
I get you.
And she said, well, in the people's understanding, sometimes it helps to have a visual image of the Buddha. So that, it's just kind of like, give us a little clue here. Give us some help in terms of understanding. And so that was kind of how she explained it to me. I don't mean to belittle the beautiful imagery. I have the medicine Buddha sitting right behind
me. I was just going to point that out. I see him behind you.
But I guess what I'm saying is it's just an interesting perspective.
Well, when I first started studying in the Tibetan tradition, everybody here knows that I studied in the Tibetan tradition for a couple decades prior to becoming more Shinzen or Shin practitioner. When I first started studying Vajrayana Buddhism, and we did all these elaborate visualizations, I don't know how much you're familiar with that. We use those kind of mantras, usually at a Tibetan Buddhism center. They're chanted in Tibet. And we use those mantras, and we do these elaborate visualizations where you visualize the Buddha, then you become the Buddha, whichever Buddha it is. And then you dissolve the Buddha image so that you're back to your normal self.
Oh, that's quite beautiful.
Yes, it is quite
Yeah.
beautiful. So, but the thing is that it's very confusing to most people, and people ask the lamas, and I was known to ask all these crazy questions, and I was
Right.
very confused most of the time about it, and because I'm a romantic at heart, but I'm also very linear and logical. At the time, I was drawn to Buddhism because it was, I call it, because I was drawn to it for the mental bling. I like studying things. So,
Mhm, mhm.
um, but so when we were doing these elaborate visualizations, which I can't visualize my way out of a paper bag, I'm just terrible at visualization. And I'm married to an artist who, so
Oh,
like
that's
when we,
hilarious.
so when we're trying to give each other directions, she draws pictures and I'm like, what? And I tell her, go to this street. And she's like, what?
That's funny.
So I can't visualize.
Mm.
So here I am in this practice where that's all we do, we visualize. And so I was so frustrated, and I guess it was my own personal angst. And I went to the director at the time and I said, okay, if we are supposed to not be attached to external images, if we are supposed to understand there's no self, no discrete thing, everything is empty, why are we conjuring up images of things and becoming them? And that's sort of what you're saying. I mean, it's like, but he was like saying, well, it's like the point of it is, and I guess that's the point. I think a little bit what Venerable Dhammananda was telling you. The point of it is to that visual image of medicine Buddha, whether it be the statue, the Tonka behind you, whatever. Um, that's no that's no more real or no more not real than me looking at your image on the screen or looking at the tree, or it's all essentially empty and without a discrete nature.
Mm.
So the fact that when you visualize it and then you dissolve it, you're back to what it's supposed to be.
Mm.
So I don't know. And I was so struck by that story you did tell about the medicine Buddha's knee. Did you say that in the statue that it had a hole in the knee or a
No, no,
oh,
that was
okay,
her visualization where she came to the image of what she wanted her medicine Buddha to look
look
like.
like okay.
Yeah,
uh,
and she's very much a healer, and just people might be interested to know that twice a month, or I'm sorry, now I can't even remember if it's 4 times a month, waxing, waning. They follow
the moon, yeah, phases,
the moon
yeah.
calendar, and there's celebrations at the temple according to those dates.
So you were going to say that she heals?
Oh, she's very much a healer, I think, and so is her mother. Her mother was a famous for healing. Um, And an example is, she'll go to, and I think you alluded to this in the beginning, actually, when you were describing her. She'll go to a woman's house in the community who maybe is dying of cancer, and she'll hold her in her arms, and they'll maybe chant the medicine Buddha prayer. Um, she just has that energy.
And how is that? I think you alluded to this in your book, but I can't remember the exact, story or words. But how is that seen in this Theravadan culture? It's despite her deep respect for all the different traditions,
Mhm.
that culture doesn't necessarily have that.
The
Too.
the Tibetan
Yeah, yeah,
medicine Buddha.
yeah, yeah.
I'm not exactly sure about that. I think she says, in her way that people probably think it's weird, but in a sense, she doesn't care because that's who she is. I mean, if she were to take seriously all the criticism that she's gotten, it would be very
She'd
hard for her.
stop. Yeah.
She'd stop, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And she comes from a healing tradition. Venerable Vormai was said to have healing eyes, healing vision.
Is that her mother? That's her
Yeah,
mother, right? Yeah.
Venerable Burma, I'm sorry. And people would literally come to the temple to have her kind of. I once asked Venerable if she thought she was psychic. She said no, it was different. It was from a higher meditation state, but she kind of could intuit. I'll just go ahead and give you an example. If you want to use it, fine. Not, that's fine. But a woman came to the temple, said somebody was creating havoc. There was a teacup falling off the table and breaking, and other odd things were happening. And Venerable Vormai looked into the woman and said, "Oh, you had an abortion." And she said, "No, I never had an abortion." And apparently, unbeknownst to her, her husband, who was a gynecologist, had removed probably something like an IUD or some kind of intrauterine device, and had not realized it at the time. There was a tiny fetus.
Oh.
And
so she didn't even know.
She didn't know. And according to Venerable Vormai, this being was crying, "How come you promised me to be my mother in this life?" I mean, this is how the story goes.
Interesting. Very interesting.
You reneged on your promise. So Venerable Vormai said, when you sit down to dinner, invite the unborn child to eat with you. Make merit.
Right.
For the child. Anyway, and as the story goes, and I tend to kind of, if you're there in Thailand and you feel all the energy, you tend to kind of go with it. Well, is that, it became the situation calmed down.
But I have to say that, like I said, I'm a kind of a linear logical person, but at the same time, I have a deep respect for all the traditions that I've been involved in, which changes my logical nature and softens it a bit. It has to, or you couldn't stay with it. Right. So I much like I would never classify myself as a secular Buddhist, which is kind of the rage in the United States, with the mindfulness culture, yes. So it becomes what they I think misappropriate Buddhism for productivity, if you know what I mean. They use it as a self-development tool. I think I talked about this with Venerable when I was on with your YouTube, expressing my kind of dismay about all that, and sure. and her answer was, let them do what they want to do.
Absolutely. I remember that pointedly. She basically said each to her own.
Yeah. I felt a little slapped upside the head. I love
that's the teaching, though.
Yeah, I love to meet with teachers who smack me, man, like that. Yeah. Because that you're really in front of a teacher when they don't care about correcting you. So, and I remember I burst out laughing when she said that because it was just so awesome. So, but yeah, and so I'm pretty much an agnostic about everything. I love the teaching stories. I love the symbolism. I love all of it. I love literature, so I love it as literature, but I also have had many experiences in my life through my Buddhist practice where can't say that I'm going to say that I doubt a lot of things anymore, because I've seen too many things that I can't really say that can't be, right? That can't be. Now in your book too, sort of back to you, Cindy, yes. In your book, because it is an interesting book, and then it bounces around between talking about Venerable Dhammananda and your life. So it's kind of like being a fly on the wall, if you will, which I always love. Absolutely. Stuff like that. I always love that. So I thought that was actually kind of brilliant in the way in which you structured that book, actually. So you could have done it a lot more dry, if you were just talking about your experience there, but it was there was so much about you, and you reveal a lot about yourself in the book, about your past, about your emotional challenges with your mother and your husband, and coming into your own strength and your spiritual journey and connecting to your family's Jewish heritage. You write wonderfully and truthfully. Which I respect. And I think many people will feel a connection to the real life truths that you reveal. I love when I read people writing, and I sense that it's in your face writing. It's just like, hey, this is who I am. This is where I was at the time. Right. So I love that. But the title of your book, and I really want to get into this now because I think it's kind of it's the deeper theme here. And I may be putting it on this, but you can tell me. The title of your book and the anecdotes you share reveals a deeper connection to all of our connections and challenges with the mother, right? You even wrote that Dhammananda, and I'm quoting this, said that in order to heal ourselves, we must heal the mother-daughter relationship. So are you comfortable sharing a little more about that in your life, how Dhammananda helped, and how maybe you could even riff off on that and explain how you might see that in other people's lives?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'm totally comfortable with that. I think that if you look at what moved me so much in meeting Venerable Dhammananda is that our mothers were kind of similar. Venerable Vormai, she was amazing. She was rode to a bicycle to Singapore with the Boy Scouts when she was 29.
Oh my goodness.
She did jujitsu. She was a journalist. She was kind of the original go-getter. And my mother was entered law school in 1934. Whoa. And was at the top of her class and I'm sorry, I should say was. I for some reason I found myself talking to her last night, so sometimes she gets present, but she was.
Well, you should explain that she's passed.
She's passed. Yeah, let me not confuse people. Yeah, she died in 2005. She was a lawyerly type, very practical, very controlling, very domineering. She, her life made sense to her. God bless her. She had rules. She had a high moral sense, moral values. And the only problem was I kind of emerged this little being that kind of needed warmth, affection. I was very sensitive. I had a high emotional sensitivity. And it was just like, what? We just kind of didn't. We were different beings.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, she was my mother. And I struggled. So I struggled. I was very lonely as a child and kind of anxious. Took a lot of the criticism. She had a very judgmental kind of side. I suppose I should give an example. I don't know.
I think anybody could sort of relate.
You get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. She had a sort of a punishing sense of sending me to my room and blah, blah, blah. But so when I met Venerable, it was like, first of all, let me say I totally loved and respected my mother because of her strong feminist stance. And she was really bright too. But there was no softness to her.
I hear
and
you.
when I met Venerable, it was like, wait a minute. You sense, I describe it like a piece of leather. Leather is very strong, but it's very supple. Leather is very soft.
Soft, right.
Yeah. And Venerable has that strength of determination. And Joan Halifax describes her as a strong back and a soft front.
Yeah, that's a pretty typical expression. A lot of people use that in Buddhism.
Yeah.
Strong back.
That gives people a little bit of a visual idea. And maybe early on when we first met, I just started crying because I was so tired. I do remember it was probably the first time we were walking in the back garden. I just started crying. And she said, it's okay, weep if you need to. People often weep when they first come here because you're allowing that soft you to come out and et cetera. And essentially, if you want to look at it in kind of psychological terms, I sort of transferred onto Venerable. She sort of became my mother.
Yeah.
And became very important to me as a strong mother figure. And in the context of the narrative in the book, sort of helped me come to terms with my own woundedness as a child and acceptance of myself and my mother in terms of understanding that was painful that I didn't get what I wanted, but let me say the quality of true forgiveness, there's a real depth of coming to grips with the painful reality of that hurt. And there's also a release, and this phenomenal release and letting go of, acceptance.
Yeah.
She helped
Yeah.
me get through that.
You know, when you write about it in the book, you really get that strong, you, even without like discrete words, you pick up the feeling of your sort of transference, your sort of attachment to
Yes.
Dhammananda. You know, probably a dirty word in Buddhism to say attachment, but you
Yeah, I definitely have one.
you seem very attached to
Yes.
Dhammananda.
Yes. Yes.
Kind of like, you know, seeing where she is at any minute and seeing if you could talk to her and feeling uncomfortable around her and all that stuff. It was very kind of endearing in that way. But I have to say, and I think those people who follow me on this podcast are going to be, well, I talked about it a little bit in introducing myself and when I shared your YouTube, is I actually felt that with her when I had the interview with her.
Interesting.
It was pretty strong too for me, and it was on a Zoom call, so it's like, whoa, how did she just emits so much soft warmth, and it is sort of motherly, yet at the same time, you're in the presence of this strong, powerful presence of a teacher, and you feel both of those things, like when she slapped me upside the head, just let them do what they want to do
in a very quiet way.
In a very quiet way. No, it was very sweet, but I mean, I know what she was saying to me.
Right.
But I really was very touched and felt kind of like almost like that same kind of attachment for a couple of days afterwards. Like I kept reading all about her, and I was like, it's kind of weird, actually. I have to say, it was just kind of weird. So, so I would share that too, so I imagine I would feel much the same way if I had met her in person. So that was kind of interesting experience.
Yes.
You were ordained and received an ordination name, had your head shaved and all that, in the typical style of the temporary ordination in the Thai lineage, which people who follow me may not be familiar with this at all, because many of them, I think, are Mahayana Buddhists and have no understanding of that tradition and how that works. And maybe could you explain that a little bit, as far as in contrast to those of us who took refuge, or were ordained in a Mahayana tradition?
Are you talking about taking the Bodhisattva precepts?
Not just in Mahayana Buddhism, those of us who are, there's a couple, in many of the schools, you take refuge, which is where you become an official Buddhist.
I see.
You take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. It's called ordination. And you a piece of your hair is cut symbolically, and you're given a Dharma name. Okay. But at the same time, in many of these traditions, you can also take bodhisattva vows, or you can take the bodhisattva vows later. And in my case, I took both of them. So, but the refuge vows are what I think most of my audience would be familiar with.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I took a second temporary ordination this past December, so it's very recent in my mind, and I write about it actually. It was a very interesting experience the second time. The first time I was kind of oblivious. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was kind of being yanked back and forth, and
right.
Quite an entertaining experience, if I may use that word. Second time was much more serious. I was much more attentive to what was going on. And to explain it, temporary simply means we go in December 2nd. We start preparing for the ordination on December 5th. We practice for 9 days. We take the 10 precepts. We take the robe. We wear the robe. We shave our heads. And we practice in a monastic tradition for 10 days, a very brief period. Then we undergo a ceremony to disrobe and go back into our lay, our regular clothing. So the idea, I just want to say a little bit about temporary ordination. I think behind Venerable's idea is that, because there was never a history of female ordination in Thailand, she was literally the first woman to be ordained as a bhikkhuni. So she kind of wanted women to understand this is what the female monastic experience is like, understanding that not everyone would choose to be a monastic.
Right.
What if we give this temporary experience? I call it like an extension class in monasticism is the way I look at it.
A certification class.
Certification, right. It's a real, profound, and life-changing experience. Not to make fun of it by calling it anyway.
No, I get.
But I also think it's kind of funny. So yes, what I came away with this last time was I had a horrible time with the robe, which I didn't have before. And the robe is quite complicated. I kind of revere it, and I'm kind of terrified of it because it's a big rectangular piece made out of patches. And there's literally a top and the bottom. And for the life of me, I couldn't tell which was the top and which was the bottom. So I constantly had to nudge somebody and say,
how do I do this?
Where do I start? Because I knew how to fold it once I got started. And so that was a dependency and an interconnection on people, that being a Westerner and maybe at my age, kind of proud or whatever, I didn't want to admit I really needed to depend on others. And it kind of made me really anxious. It's like, is somebody going to be there? We got to change our robes at a certain point in the ceremony. How am I going to get it on? Blah, blah, blah. So, at the end, it's funny. I was just talking to a friend about this last night. Basically, I think what Venerable said was those people who don't really learn how to depend on others suffer. And that was kind of my learning from this, is that, you're not going to do this alone, honey.
Yeah.
You need other people. And that was my takeaway from this, among many other things. Just getting through the process of the ceremony, we really helped each other. The Sangha, the community, was instrumental.
Let me ask you, and in setting up this contrast between taking refuge in the Mahayana tradition, when you take refuge, you take certain vows. Some of the schools, they're all a little different. You take the precepts, some you don't. It all depends. But when you take the precepts and get a Dharma name in a temporary, and then you disrobe and you go home, are you still considered to be under the precepts and maybe use the Dharma name, if you know what I mean?
Excellent question. No, you're not still under the precepts.
That's what I thought.
The last 5 are, not eating after lunch. There's several that just don't apply to lay life. No, that's the idea. You resume lay life, hopefully with the immersion and the depth and the intensity of having experienced that depth connection to the Buddhist tradition. So that I've always felt I come out transformed from those experiences. I don't carry on with the traditions. I don't continue to wear the robe or observe the precepts in that way, in that formal way. No.
So another question. And feel free to say I don't want to answer it if you want. I'm going to be a little pushier on this one. Is that since I so strongly identify with the Mahayana tradition and taking refuge and taking bodhisattva vows, and those are lifelong in my mind. Okay. And when I took multiple names because I was ordained multiple times, but then my last name, Shinyo, is the name I was given when I became a sensei or a lay minister. But so of course I keep that one. But I have a string of Tibetan names as well. But I have always kept not the precepts. I have kept my refuge vows to my heart and my bodhisattva vows to my heart. I know those are lifelong. So my question to you would be, since that was temporary, now you're back home, you're in the United States, do you think about joining another sangha, taking refuge vows, or do you ever consider that, or because you really strongly consider Venerable your teacher, that would not even be in your mind? Or you hear what I'm saying?
Well, certainly. First of all, my ordained name is Dhammananda, and I take pride in that name. And I want to say that she is always with me. Now, I may not observe her per se, or take on the name, but the experience of having lived through that monastic experience is with me. I'm sorry, I can't say how. It's not a linear thing, but it's in me.
I get you. Yeah.
And when I go to, we have a spiritual center called Spirit Rock here in Northern California. When I go there, you're allowed in a silent retreat to take the precepts. So I don't think I've quite taken them on in the same way you have. But I think what's interesting when you look at, I had a program we did at Inside LA with Venerable and Trudy Goodman, and it was on meditation, and an Asian, Thai woman came on and said, we have mindfulness here, but we don't have sila as much.
Yeah, sila.
In her country, the precepts are the first step to meditation practice. And I just want to mention that I think you're bringing up a really good point. I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I think we need maybe more of what you're saying.
Yeah.
To remind us of the moral direction, if I can call the precepts moral that way, to guide us. I'm not quite answering your question, but I like what you're saying.
Well, it's okay. It's okay. I've always considered the precepts guidelines and not rules, not like the 10 commandments or something, what I mean? Because I think, who's to say? I can't say what the Buddha had in mind or anything. But to me, the spirit of the precepts were never about the rules. If you were a lay person, they were never about those monastic rules. Those things, even in the Mahayana tradition, we have the 10 precepts, not monastic precepts, which you were talking about, not eating after a certain. The 10 precepts in Mahayana tradition have nothing to do with that, really. They don't. So, but they are guidelines. They are guidelines. I feel I'm a lay Buddhist minister, and therefore I think of my audience as lay people. Okay. And therefore, and lay people who need that Buddhist way of being to help their lives. But to get that Buddhist way of being, they do need to align to something.
Yes.
Some kind of something.
Some kind of guideline. Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, it's the 10 precepts don't do it for me. I think they're great guidelines, but I think the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path is pretty much all you need as a lay Buddhist to keep yourself in line, which is why my first book was structured around that. Because in Tibetan Buddhism and in Zen Buddhism and Shin Buddhism, that's still the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's all throughout.
I would say the precepts definitely have their part in my experience in terms of guiding me to what is wholesome behavior and what I consider wholesome. And it is helpful for me to have those as a guideline.
Yeah, that's why I call them guidelines. But a lot of people come to Buddhism like from nowhere, they don't, and then they think that they get all freaky outy about taking to 10, and then the precepts, and then it's like rules from above, like Moses delivered it on a tablet, and you got to do this thing, or you're gonna burst into flames or something. Right. It's and I think because of our Christian culture, that's sort of the conceptualization of what the 10 precepts are. And I'm always saying, chill. Right. Use them as guidelines, like a chalk mark or something,
right. Right. Yeah. It's like, right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. But, a guideline fits for me. Yeah.
But for the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, to me, you better keep that in concrete.
That certainly keep it in mind.
Yes. Yeah. That's to me everything. And so when I talk with people, I'm constantly, like the second of the Eightfold Path, or like that. And I will constantly refer to that, because I think the more people are familiar with that, the more that actually changes their way of seeing the world. And Buddhism is nothing. And Venerable Dhammananda agreed with me on this. Buddhism is nothing unless it's in your everyday.
Yes.
And absolutely. Too many people take it up as a scholarly practice, and it's not in there every day.
Yes. And by the way, I think that's what she would argue is in the feminine tradition, the feminine lineage, where she would say the male monks often teach from the texts, in Thailand anyway, and the theory. But when she speaks, she teaches on the basis of her experience.
Exactly. And my teacher said Buddhism is dead if it's only in books. It only becomes alive if you try it on, try it out. The Buddha said that. The Buddha said, try it out.
The lived experience.
Yeah. If it doesn't work for you, forget it. But if it works, take it up. So yeah, we went crazy on this one. We kept going and going and going. But
yeah, you'll have to think. Yeah.
We're not going to edit this. I love it. This is what I like about my conversations, because I don't plot them. I let them go organically. I think that's important. Now to your weekly YouTube series, Casual Buddhism, where you invite people to ask questions of Venerable Dhammananda. You asked me to be a guest, like I said before, and I appeared in late January, and it really was a profound moment for me. But I've tried to catch all your YouTube podcasts, and I'm not caught up yet, because there's quite a few.
There's quite a few. Yeah.
There's quite a few. But like I told you, I got all attached to Venerable Dhammananda, and I couldn't get enough of her.
She is quite amazing. Yes.
I mean, just that smile. It's just like me. It's just wonderful. Totally wonderful. But I haven't seen them all. But it's wonderful to see the interactions, and I really want to encourage the listeners to watch it, because what I like about it is there's this presence of Venerable Dhammananda, and she changes with the interaction with her guests. It's like the Buddha, that he delivered his message to the audience based on what they need. She does the same thing. I didn't see her doing too many slapping upside the heads like she did with me, but hey, so maybe I needed it more. But she
does speak directly to people in a very kind way.
Yeah, she does. She does. Yeah. But I love how she and I encourage people to watch it, because one of the things that I catch from her is that she'll take somebody's question and she goes way beyond what seems to be the thread of it. She goes deep.
Yes. Right.
And how did you conceive of this idea How did you propose it to Venerable? And how does she feel about it now?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you for mentioning it. That's great. I also welcome people to approach me if they'd like to meet Venerable, and
That's great.
Yeah, they can do that just through my website, cindyrasicot.com.
Well, I'll put all that stuff in my show notes.
Oh,
So
okay.
they
Thank you.
have plenty of places to get
I
there.
just put that little plug in.
That's good. No problem.
Okay. And how we came about it, it was the pandemic.
Uh-huh.
I just come back from the temple, I think, in January. In fact, I literally had to come home. The State Department ordered me to come home on February 19th of 2020, I think it
Oh,
was.
of course. Yeah.
And I had just been separated, divorced. I
Oh,
was very lonely. The pandemic, living alone, sort of accentuated the loneliness and
of
the
course.
disconnection. And I can, well, first of all, always in the back of my mind is I would love for other people to hear Venerable Dhammananda speak. So that's kind of in the back of my mind. But also for me personally, I just needed psychological or spiritual support.
I got it.
And we talked, and she actually came up with the idea of, I think she called it casual. She called it something else, but it had the word casual in it. And she said, I just want to be able to come on, speak to people. Don't pre-rehearse it, make it spontaneous. Make it short. Let's just let people have a chance to talk about whatever's on their minds in a spiritual way.
That's wonderful. She wanted to do it.
She wanted to do it. She loves it. She really enjoys Westerners because you have to understand within a Thai context, people revere her. They look up to her. They're very careful about their behavior around her. Yeah. I am, as a Westerner, speak probably much more freely than the average Thai woman.
Yeah, of course.
And she just, first of all, she's a born teacher. She lights up. Yeah. She's got it in her heart and her soul to teach. She's very charismatic. And when she gets into this conversation, she just really enjoys it. So it's something that
you can tell. Yeah, she
really feeds off of it.
Yeah, you can tell.
And I did ask her at one point, because she said, I think she said last May, she made an announcement that she was pulling back from some of her, because she's 78 now, she was pulling back from some of her activities. And I said, is this okay? She said, oh yeah, I really like doing this. So
it energizes her. Probably. Yeah, it keeps her alive, right? Well, I think that's a great place to end, because we've plugged you. Plugged your book. We definitely plugged Venerable. Actually, there was something in your book, because you put a footnote in it about that she even had a TED Talk. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's Doi Sutep is what it's called.
I'm going to find that, and I'm going to put it in the show notes, because I haven't seen it, but I have it written down to remind myself to do it. So.
Yeah, and one exciting thing is she's working with a woman from France, actually. They have a website, thaibhikkhunis.com, but wow. they're going to have a new website, which is named after the temple Sangdhamma Kalyani. I don't know the actual name of it, but I just want to alert people to that. It's going to be kind of a high, more informative, probably... I'm excited about it. I don't know what it's going to look like, but it's coming up.
Well, that's good. That's maybe we'll have you back on when that happens, and so we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the only last thing I want to say is, if you're ever interested in going, it's quite an experience, and I would encourage you to, if you have that urge.
Well, I have the urge. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Okay. I have an autoimmune condition, immune deficiency. So I don't even, with the pandemic, it's, I was never much of a traveler to begin with, but this makes it even worse. I have to be very careful. I've been sort of my partner and I have sort of been prisoners in our house, except when we go out, and when we go out, we're in masks. It's not been great. But yeah, life is what life is, right? So,
Well, thank you so
there's
much.
so much more we could talk about. Is there any other thing you want to mention that I didn't talk about before we close?
No, I would just like to say that, yeah, there's one other thing. I saw the memoir. I saw my Finding Venerable Mother as a memoir. It's kind of part one of a sequel, and part two is a second book I'm working on, which is more about Venerable Dhammananda's life in particular,
Uh-huh.
her life to path to ordination and her teachings. So I'm just kind of excited about that. I almost feel like part one, the Buddha said, be beneficial to yourself and be beneficial to others. And part one of my journey was I kind of had to figure out who I was and what I was doing in relationship to her. And the second part is going to be for others, her story.
That's perfect. Well, we'll definitely have you on when that comes
Thank
out.
you. Thank you so much. This has been fabulous. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and you just have to promise to invite me to, if you will take second go rounds, maybe I can talk to Venerable again.
Absolutely. We'll have you back.
It's wonderful to talk with you today, Cindy. Thank you so much for being on this show.
Be well.
That's it for this episode. You can find more about Cindy and Venerable Dhammananda in the show notes. Next up, some announcements, of course. As always, a reminder that you can join me and others in the private, donation-supported Everyday Sangha that meets virtually via Zoom every other week on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. The Sangha has recently begun a new study of the book Heart of the Shin Buddhist Path, A Life of Awakening by Takamaro Shigaraki. Our meetings consist of a service first, including a short meditation period, traditional vow recitations and other invocations like refuge, bodhisattva vows, etc., and some chanting. The service introduces more ritual and liturgy into the structure of our meeting, much like you would find at a non-virtual Buddhist temple, church, or sangha. The service includes a Dharma talk by one of the practice leaders or myself, Wendy Shinyo Sensei, and many times a special Dharma glimpse by a volunteer Sangha member. After the service, we open it up to discussion of the current book study or of anything that was inspired by one of the Dharma talks. Consider joining the Sangha at this time as we start a new study and be a part of the new study, practice, and a warm and welcoming Sangha community. You can learn more about the Sangha and get a feel for it by viewing the latest bonus YouTube podcast, where me, Bradley Janayo Sensei, and Terry Hoskin, both of those two are our practice leaders, talk about what the Sangha and what everyday Buddhism is all about. You can also support this podcast and the other activities of Everyday Buddhism by becoming a community member for $5 a month. If you do, you will have access to all members-only podcasts, an education series, and a private group on a non-Facebook platform. Now, if you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and join the membership community or the Everyday Sangha. Just go to www.everyday-buddhism.com and click on either the tab that says Join Members Community or Join Everyday Sangha. I thank all of you who contribute. This podcast and the community and the Sangha depend on your donations to continue to exist. I do not seek podcast sponsors and do not ask for financial commitments through paid podcast memberships. So my work and the cost of the infrastructure needed to support what I do is entirely self-funded, except for your donations. Please consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or on my website's donate tab. You can even buy me a coffee on the Coffee Cup link on the website. You can find all these links in the show notes as well. And thanks, too, to all of you who write in with comments and questions. I do read everything. I can't always respond, like I say, but I would love to respond to everyone. Another way you can help is to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It's important to share the podcast with others if you find it helpful in your life. And if you could, take a minute to comment so people will know why you love everyday Buddhism. That's all for the announcement. So until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.